There's no question that nations that seriously restrict freedom of press and speech at home are in many cases some of the most determined propagandists abroad. I was particularly struck by what Ambassador Haqqani said, the use of media as a tool to shape and reinforce narratives may be a big part of what we're looking at. We had a brief mention of RT, which kind of is Vladimir Putin's owned media operation, projecting his opinions. Now, I agree with what Jeffrey Goldberg was saying, which is that RT is not taken terribly seriously here in this country. It's so over the top. And even the addition of Larry King, I don't think has brought it great popularity. It's an odd way for Larry King to end his career. But I've been told on good authority that RT Arabic, which very much mongers conspiracy theories in the Middle East, is actually quite popular. Anyway, to tackle these and other questions we have on this panel, James Glassman, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and also founding Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. We have Robert Reilly, former Department of State Senior Advisor for Information and current Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, and Bret Stephens, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Deputy Editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. So let me start with this. Jim, why don't you just talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about a war of ideas.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and especially among so many distinguished and interested people. So what's a war of ideas? Well, we're engaged in ideological combat around the world, where ultimately the victory of our ideas is really going to determine a lot of our ultimate security. And the term war of ideas is something that I came to the State Department very excited about promoting and even using those words. And I think we were successful in doing that. But as I was leaving, and the transition team came in, Tom Donilon warned me, kind of in a nice way, that I shouldn't use this term among the Obamaites. And I think there was maybe an issue about kind of belligerence, that we shouldn't use the word war. I'm not really exactly sure why. But I think I'm not sure what Ambassador Fernandez said, but I kind of doubt that you're hearing this term war of ideas very much. Specifically, what we felt, what our objective was number one, to push back against the ideology of the terrorists, which is very powerful, and second, to divert young people from a path that would lead them to becoming terrorists. And a major part of that was indoctrination in the ideology. So the ideology really counts. Ideas really count. One of the reasons that we won the Cold War was because we understood that, and I think there is a lack of understanding of that, or certainly a kind of reticence to have a full-throated battle of ideas today.
Bob, agree or disagree, but I'll take it a little further. If there is a war of ideas and it's being waged against us, are we fighting it or are we not fighting it? Are we winning it or are we losing it, this administration or other administrations?
First of all, I'd start by saluting Jim Glassman, who head and shoulders was the finest Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy in the Bush administration. The problem was he was only there for such a short time, and by the time he got there, the financial resources of his office had been depleted, and he couldn't do many of the superb things he was trying to do. So there's very little I would disagree with Jim. This is a war of, we need to just take a moment to address what the substance of wars of ideas are. They're about moral legitimacy. Moral legitimacy, in turn, is about one's conception of justice. So in this war of ideas, as in past ones, whether with Nazi Germany or the Soviet Empire, we are contending over differing conceptions of justice. And what we need to do is establish our moral legitimacy and undermine the moral legitimacy of our opponents. Are we doing that? No, we are not. And most particularly in this new war of ideas, we are not, because the ideas of our opponent are tinged with religion. And we're very sensitive about that particular issue, with the unfortunate consequence that we have conceded to them a theological safe haven, in which safe haven they are able to preserve the moral legitimacy of their ideas, which we then have no platform from which to attack. I think I was looking over some of Hillary Clinton's comments in recent years about the status of the war of ideas. I think if she gets it, anybody can. And as she said in one of her congressional testimonies, so we are in an information war and we are losing that war. I'll be very blunt in my assessment. Al-Jazeera is winning, unquote. In another testimony, our broadcasting board of governors is practically defunct. She's referring to the board of governors that oversees all non-military U.S. government broadcasting, including Voice of America and other entities. Defunct in terms of its capacity to be able to tell a message around the world. So we are abdicating the ideological arena, unquote.
Bret, follow up on that, but particularly the point I think that Bob makes. We have plenty of experience in the 20th century fighting ideologies. Is it very different because the current ideology is also a theology that we find ourselves hamstrung, and as Bob says, we find we've creating a safe haven for ideologies that are hostile to us if they're based on Scripture?
I think what Bob said is profound. I do want to say at the beginning just how honored I am to be here at FDD, which is just a wonderful, wonderful organization, wonderfully led, but also I think wonderfully joined by the people in this audience. And I'm just looking around, seeing people I know from Egypt and Iran and elsewhere who are the real soldiers in the war of ideas on the ground, as opposed to armchair generals like me.
By the way, speaking, I neglected to say, Chairman Ed Royce, House Foreign Affairs Committee, I believe is here in the audience, and I want to thank him for joining us. I've neglected to mention it. Just wave if you're here. I know you are here. But thank you for joining us. Yeah, I forgot.
So, I mean, one of the problems that historically liberalism has had in its confrontation with totalitarian ideologies, whether they are of the communist, fascist, or now I would say, I still use this term unapologetically, Islamo-fascist varieties, is that liberalism in many respects is a negative ideology. It emphasizes process and it emphasizes the absence of certain things. And it's very difficult to wage an ideology against a set of principles, precepts, and notions of virtue with a contrary set which is sort of is neutral on all of those things. One of the critical failings of the Bush administration was to emphasize the word democracy. Democracy is merely a process. Democracy is an election from which you have some kind of result, and the result is deemed to be automatically of some moral value because that is the will of the people. So a democratic election gave us the Erdogan regime in Turkey, and a democratic election gave us the Hamas regime in Gaza, and a democratic election gave us the Morsi government in Egypt. So this was democracy leading to illiberalism. And the Bush administration would have helped itself at the beginning by talking less about the kind of process concept of democracy and more about the positive notions of what is meant by a liberal democracy or by liberalism itself. What are the virtues inherent in a free society, and what are the prerequisites of a free society? And we've never really joined that battle in the way that it ought to be joined. We're uncomfortable speaking about these sorts of things. Actually, from my point of view, it's quite marvelous because I love talking about gay rights in the service of combating Islamism in Iran and Saudi Arabia and Gaza and so on, not least because it makes so-called progressives in this country so very uncomfortable when I speak about it. One thing, just to get to the question you specifically raised, I was overhearing earlier one of your speakers talking about the true meaning of Islam. And one of the most nauseating habits of this administration, but also frankly of the former administration, is to interpret Islam for Muslims. I don't really think that that's really the business that we ought to be engaged in. I have no idea of what the true meaning of Islam is, and I certainly don't think that President Obama does, or Hillary Clinton, or least of all John Kerry. That's not what we should be talking about, the real meaning of Islam. We should be talking about the real meaning of a liberal society in which many voices are heard, in which the dignity of the individual and the inviolability of the individual and his conscience and his freedom of action are emphasized. And that's the kind of battle that we need to be waging. But in order to do that, you need a profound concept of liberalism that is not simply about process or the absence of various things, that has a positive, morally substantive dimension to it. So I think what the war of ideas has to be joined philosophically before it's joined sort of in the realm of, quote, communication strategy or all the rest of that.
Let me just press you on one point before, and that is this. During the Cold War, we made a very serious effort to understand communism. There were whole journals devoted to understanding communism, understanding how Soviet communism was different from Chinese communism, was different from Albanian communism, was different from Euro communism. I would say Churchill.
Euro-communism was the worst, but go ahead.
Churchill, I think, believed he understood the ideology that underlie fascism in its various forms, and was very clear at the end of the war that what we needed to destroy was not Germany, was not Japan, was not Italy, but the ideologies that had taken over. Those ideologies had to be delegitimized, discredited. So when we say we can't understand, and probably shouldn't even try to understand Islam or Islamism or jihadism, or whether there are distinctions among them or how they interrelate, aren't we in a way doing what Robert says, which is kind of giving a safe haven and not engaging with the ideologies that seek to defeat and destroy us?
Well, look, there's obviously a value in sort of understanding in a deep sense and taking seriously and sincerely what Zawahiri is saying, or the supreme leader of Iran. It's not to give them lectures about what, how they're deviating from the true meaning of Islam, whatever that may, whatever that may be. But what I'm simply saying is we need to develop a positive concept of liberalism. And by the way, liberalism, I mean, in a sense that seems to have gone out of usage sometime around 1890 or so.
I remember that.
I know you do, Cliff. You're older than you look. And that's really how to join this battle of ideas, because right now it's being waged in a very poor sense. An Egyptian friend of mine made an interesting point. He said, look, when you have an argument with a Muslim brother, and the Muslim brother says, the logical, the moral ideology of the West leads to a society in which pornography becomes ubiquitous. How do you address that issue? Well, one way of addressing it is say, well, pornography is actually fantastic and it's a positive good, and well, you're not going to get very far from saying that. But you can make the case that a society in which pornography is tolerated as a defect of freedom is nonetheless preferable to the kind of society in which it's prohibited as a defect of virtue. That's the way in which you begin to engage ideas seriously. We don't even do that. We don't even act as if the Muslim Brotherhood has something quite serious to say that, by the way, finds echoes in the Western political tradition. Because really the great confrontation right now, ideologically, is between the votaries of virtue, Islamic virtue in the case in which we're speaking about, and the votaries of freedom and a free society. It's the classic conflict of the ancients against the moderns. No one ever talks about this because, God forbid, you should talk about Leo Strauss and other people who have thought about this in a serious way, and not just Strauss, by the way. Nobody ever wants to talk about this because we're kind of more interested in talking about having a communication strategy or extra funding for Voice of America, that kind of thing. Whereas we hadn't actually really spent a lot of time thinking about what is this idea of the West and what are its essential features that we want to be promoting for the rest of the Arab or Muslim world.
I'll go back to Jim because I think the criticism that Bret makes of the Bush administration, I'd like you to explore, not to be offensive about, and that would be that it was an emphasis on democracy rather than liberal democracy is one way to see it.
Right,
So
I see that's your name, by the way.
It is indeed, and although the reason it's in the plural is we mean it to refer to democratic societies rather than democracy as an institution. But when we do talk about democracy as an institution, I do think, and this was something I differed with I was privileged to be on a committee reporting to Condi Rice on the question of democracy. There wasn't enough emphasis on liberal democracy, by which I mean not simply elections, but elections after you have free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, all those things you need. And if you have elections in the absence of those freedoms, as we did, for example, in Gaza, it is evanescent.
So you'll wait 30 years before you have an election. So let me just tell you what.
Listen, that is a good question. I'd love to have you explore it because maybe so.
So let me respond.
Because it may wait 30 years for the next election in Gaza.
Well, that could well be. So I can't speak for President Bush, and I wasn't there in the beginning of the administration. All I know is, the last 4 years that I spent with him, what I heard from him over and over again was a phrase that he used during the administration many times, which is freedom is universal. Not democracy is universal, but freedom is universal, and that is to say that it's not just for us white people here, but it's for everybody. And that is, I think that was the guiding principle of the administration. He absolutely, and one of our major programs, in fact, is helping to build civil society institutions in Egypt, which ain't easy, obviously, but for exactly this reason, that you cannot have, as Bret says, you can't have the kind of democracy we have in the United States or elsewhere without building these civil society institutions. But it is an important question, what's the order in which you do it? Maybe you shouldn't have elections immediately. Maybe it's not so bad to have an election immediately and then somebody comes into office who's not able to fulfill his promises and then something else happens. I'm just not sure. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I believe that democracy alone is not enough. And I think, not speaking for President Bush, I think he believes that as well. I also thought your other statement, Bret, about President Bush and Islam, another thing I didn't have any direct experience with. Our policy, certainly, when I was running the War of Ideas, was that we did not ourselves, that is to say State Department officials, try to lecture Muslims about what true Islam is. And that was more for reasons of effectiveness than anything else. I mean, nobody's going to listen to that kind of nonsense. So, but what you were saying about understanding the ideology, whether it's religious-based or not, is absolutely necessary. One of the things that I tried to do, and I hope there's somebody in this audience would love to fund it, I couldn't quite get it off the ground, was something Abe Brumberg started, as I think many of you in this room know, under USIA, Problems of Communism, which was a great publication that really took the ideology that we were confronting seriously, examined it, took it apart, and I think we need something like that. I know that Hudson has something somewhat similar, but I try to start something called Problems of Extremism. They'll be very similar to that, but not just a publication, but a platform for conferences and for other kinds of work. So I do think that's an important component. Let me just say one last thing about religion ideology. I think one of the most effective tools that we had in opposition to al-Qaeda were the voices of, let's call them apostates. They wouldn't like us to say that, but people who kind of changed sides, like Dr. Fadl, who was the subject of a long there's a long piece about him in the New Yorker several years ago. So he was one of the chief ideological keepers of the ideological flame for al-Qaeda. He changed sides, and that had a big, big impact. So those are the voices that really count. It's not my voice, not your voice.
Go ahead, I
Yes.
can see your.
Well, I would like to say one thing about freedom as it's presented in our pop culture and in our public diplomacy, which for some misguided reason has sought to reinforce the image that pop culture creates by actually using it in our broadcasts, most especially Radio Sawa to the Middle East. Freedom without purpose repulses. And insofar as we present ourselves as a cafeteria of morals and religions, with the underlying indifference to which one of those you might choose, we are presenting an image of ourselves that others find extremely unattractive. Because we don't do what Bret Stephens suggested by addressing the underlying moral principles of a liberal society, which are embedded finely in a natural theology as well as a philosophy, spelled out rather brilliantly in our Declaration of Independence. Now, freedom is not really universal because it is not acknowledged as being so in those countries and within those cultures that do not accept the fundamental underlying moral principle that all people are created equal. Everyone who was mystified by the derailing of the Arab Spring in Egypt and elsewhere failed to ask themselves the question, do the people in Egypt accept the fact that Muslims and Copts are equal, that men and women are equal, that maybe even a Jew and a Muslim are equal? Obviously, that question answers itself. Of course they don't accept equality, and to the extent they don't, nor do they therefore subscribe to the principle that freedom is universal. Now, I just want to get to Jim. Dr. Fadl's not an apostate, and he was so powerful in his rejection of Zawahiri because he's not an apostate.
Right. Apostate's the wrong
Yeah.
word. He's
Reform.
not right.
Okay.
And he changed his mind.
But, you know, I think you're pointing to another huge lack. Not only do we not establish our own moral legitimacy in the eyes of our opponents as well as our allies, we don't undermine that of our enemies by working with the very people in the Muslim world whose success is most directly in our interest. More than 10 years into this war, we do not support or protect those people. It is utterly astonishing. I just want to close my few remarks by using a quote that I've been very fond of since I first came upon it from Judge Hamoud al-Hittar in Yemen, who started a Quranic duel program in the prisons there with the captured al-Qaeda members. And he would come with his Quran, they'd have their Quran, and the agreement was whoever won the argument as to whether what you're doing in your terrorist activities is Quranic or not Quranic, I'll give up terrorism and join you, or Judge Hittar said, if you convince me, I'll join al-Qaeda. Well, he won all the debates. He said, quote, if you study terrorism in the world, you will see that it has an intellectual theory behind it. And any kind of intellectual idea can be defeated by the intellect, unquote. In other words, you have to take it seriously. You can't concede a theological safe haven, which is much more valuable than a physical safe haven, to our opponents. We are not doing that. Just one last thing, Cliff, not only we are not doing it, but we don't have a place from which to do it. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Information Agency from the early 80s. I've worked in the White House, the Defense Department, the State Department, and I can tell you we no longer have a place from which to fight our side in this war of ideas. So much of this discussion is superfluous in that way. We could all agree I'm sure with Jim Glassman and Bret and also Cliff, on what a great program would be, but we have no place from which to do it.
I want to really quickly.
Go ahead, sure.
Because Bret used the term "we," and you brought up this issue that is really troubling me, which is we can say "we" all day long, but if we don't, as you say, Robert, if we don't have a place from which to be the "we," then we got nothing. And I think that's generally the case right now. And also, let me just respond to what you said about freedom is universal. Here's what I meant. I meant the words of the Declaration of Independence, which say that we have these inalienable rights that can't be taken away because they're given to us by God.
Oh, no,
And
yes,
they
of
are,
course.
life, liberty, and
Yes.
pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
So everybody has that. That's a theological belief that we've all got that. Now, whether we live in a culture or a society in which that's recognized, that's another case.
Before we leave this issue, let me get a very quick answer from you. Is what you're saying that we need to reestablish United States Information Agency, United States Information Service, that lacking that we can't do what we need to do? Is that what your
what I'm
argument?
saying?
Yeah.
I'm getting there. I basically think that I testified in front of Congressman Royce's committee and said that I felt that that it was necessary for all or most of the Broadcasting Board of Governors to be part of the State Department. And I don't know whether I actually said we should resurrect the USIA, but I think whether it's that or some other institution, there's no one in the government talking about these really important issues that we're discussing here on this stage.
Rob, do you think it should be reconstituted?
When I had a chance to brief a presidential candidate on this issue, I said, Senator, you're president now. It's come to your attention we're losing the war of ideas. Whom do you call? Whom are you going to get on the carpet here to say you're failing? Nobody. Nobody's
Right. So in the Bush
responsible for this.
administration, for a very short period of time, you could have called me.
I know, but you.
No, but I'm just saying. So
with
that
all due
is
deference,
that's one answer to the
you were
organizational question.
You were a third-level State Department official in a position which both
I
Republican
always thought
and
it was
Democrat.
second level. But.
Well, there's the secretary.
deputy, I know.
But Jim, my point is not to
But first
denigrate
rate.
you. The point.
No,
Yeah,
I understand.
Right. The State Department conducts our diplomacy. You can't conduct public diplomacy inside an institution whose primary responsible is diplomacy, because the two missions conflict, and that was a difficult position you were put in. So my answer clearly is, without the reconstruction of an agency like USIA, which has as its sole responsibility the conduct of our side in this war of ideas, we will continue to fail and be absent from this fight.
So Edward R. Murrow, the great journalist, I'll let you explain why you're shaking your head, but I'll also throw out a question in as well. Edward R. Murrow was the head of the USIA. Okay, whatever. Great journalist, for anybody who doesn't remember, great broadcast journalist. So Bret, if they asked you to be head of the new USIA like Edward R. Murrow was way back when, you would say yes or no?
First of all, it would depend on the pay.
$140,000.
It's not a lot of pay.
I don't know about that.
Pay's not good, but you are exempt from Obamacare and you get government health care. So
Look, no, I would say no, and I would not urge another USIA. The problem is that, like the problem with kingship in general, Jim Glassman can't be king, all the time, and you're going to get the wrong administrations, and quite frankly, like all government agencies, it tends towards mediocrity or worse. I mean, what you need is, number one, senior public officials, not USIA people or kind of second or third level diplomats, but senior public officials who understand this and who can articulate the language of liberty in a way that's convincing and moving to people. Natan Sharansky in prison, as he tells the story, when Reagan called it, said this is the evil empire. It was Ronald Reagan saying it was the evil empire. It wasn't like, the undersecretary for political affairs at the State Department calling it the evil empire. So it's to have a kind of senior leadership, and secondly, it's to have private institutions or non-governmental organizations, a term I hate, but like FDD, who do this kind of work just on a much vaster and scale than what's being done than what's being done now. Because I'd frankly rather have an FDD conference, except having it, 5 times this size in 5 different countries, than having a well-funded, well-stocked State Department effort that's going to screw up and it's going to deteriorate anyway. A big problem we have is that we look to organizations like the CIA or even the Defense Department from the 1940s and 1950s, which was a very particular moment in history when there was some faith in government. Great people went into government. Great people stayed in government. That's just no longer the case. And so, when you sort of look to wage the war of ideas, I think you have to look to private resources, not government agencies.
All right, I'll let you get back to this. I'm going to ask 2 more questions. And while I'm doing that, I can multitask. If you want to ask a question, show me your hand, and then I'll get a microphone to you. Okay, great. But I do want to ask these two questions. And you mentioned Radio Sawa. Not everybody here may know the story. Very briefly, Robert, tell the story of Radio Sawa. What it was meant to do. What you think it did do.
When I was Voice of America director for a short period, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which operates independently, they're not in the chain of command of the executive branch of the government, so they're out there freelancing. They decided to kill VOA's Arabic language program, which we had 12 hours a day, a mix of traditional VOA program. It needed to be shaped up and so forth, and we would have done that, but they said, no, we're going to shut that down. You no longer have an Arabic service. And our one radio service to the Middle East is going to be a youth pop music station called Radio Sawa, which presents a melange of Arab pop music and then our Britney Spears, J-Lo, and Eminem, with some of the lyrics edited because they would be so offensive to Muslim audiences. And within that hour, there would be 2 5-minute news breaks at the beginning. So if you wish to project at a time of war, after we have been attacked, the image of ourselves as a juvenile superpower, we succeeded in doing this. And I would just one last note. When I was in Baghdad in 2003 with the Defense Department, and when my former association with VOA had been revealed to a young Iraqi journalist, he comes to me across the rubble and starts shaking his fist in my face and said, "Why did you do that? Why did you stop broadcasting ideas and news and start playing music to us?" He felt the implicit condescension in that change of programming. And I think everybody did get that message.
So, one more question, then I'm going to your questions, but I think you'll see why this follows. So somebody, I forget if it was you, Jim, said we're talking about we. What do we know? What do we mean when we say we? And if we're saying that in a war of ideas, we have to project our values as superior, as that freedom is better than slavery, that getting to choose your leaders is better than having your leaders choose for you. Human rights is better than no human rights. That free people and free markets are a good idea. That's what the Wall Street Journal's editorial board would project. Others,
yeah, I like we as the Wall Street Journal.
We as the Wall Street Journal, and your information about. But others would say, no. We want to. That's not how we feel. Western Europe may be called post-democratic at this point. If you're seriously multicultural, you feel we have one model of society. There are others. Who are we to judge which is better? So if we believe in tolerance and other societies believe in intolerance, who are we to say that intolerance is worse than tolerance? Which is an odd thing logically to say. Can you comment on this? You see what I'm driving at, don't you?
Yeah, well, this is a very serious problem, and I actually don't know if there's a solution. And if you go into the bookstore of the American University of Beirut or in Cairo, who's on the shelf? Noam Chomsky and Ed Said. That's we. Well, if that's we, we're screwed. So how do you, I'm not quite sure how you address that problem, because so much of what's toxic that's coming out of the Middle East right now emerged sometime in 1967 at Columbia University or places like that. So much of what's toxic that's coming out of the Middle East is essentially a product of Western academia. Okay, Pol Pot and these characters were all educated at Sciences Po or wherever they were educated. Half the leader. I once was in Davos in one of these bizarre dinners with half the leadership of the Islamic Republic, and they all had graduate degrees from American universities. I once interviewed the deputy head of the Muslim Brotherhood. He went to the University of Missouri. That is what we are producing and what we are generating. It's very difficult to know whether the West can generate an idea of itself that reflects a certain set of values to which we pretend to subscribe, but which we have kind of voided of any real content. What does human rights mean when the premier spokesman for human rights in the West is a group called Human Rights Watch? I don't know. You need to start establishing, I guess my answer briefly would, you need to start establishing a kind of alternative set of institutions that are going to promote a we or a counter we or a conservative counter we, whatever it is, that speaks to a profounder vision of Western society and Western values and the Western idea than what we're getting now from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or various other places we can all mention. And to some extent, these places exist. I mean, I would say FDD is an important component of that. But we need more, faster, as Mike Ledeen likes to say.
Can I go to the questions, or are you champing at the bit?
I just, I need to say a word in defense of Radio Sawa, which was not invented on my watch, but I certainly endorsed it. And the idea was that you actually had two different means of broadcasting into the Middle East. One was by television, which was supposed to be, my understanding, is the main substitute for VOA Arabic, and that's Al Hurra. And then second was Radio Sawa, which was an attempt, and you certainly raise a legitimate criticism, which I also have raised, about to reach young people. So the idea was, the way to reach young people was to have music, both indigenous, local music and American music, plus news. And then when something really big happens, then you can extend the news and information period way beyond the 5 or 7.5 minutes or whatever the number is. And so I think to me that's something that you can legitimately argue about whether it's effective or not. We did a fair amount of research that shows it's pretty effective.
I was impressed by the research because I had to implement the idea, but we don't teach our young people about the underlying principles of democracy by playing
but we
pop music. Excuse me.
We certainly have news on music on shows that have
news,
music. That's all.
And you know what happens in the Middle East is I do too. As soon as the news comes on, the cab drivers turn off, they switch to another station. You don't win the war of ideas with the battle of the bands. I'm not against using music in programming. Voice of America did that successfully for many, many years. But as I talked to the Dean of Journalism in Jordan, asking him without any prejudice, what do you think about Radio Sawa? His answer was, it's fun, but it's irrelevant.
I'm going to throw on the table.
I would just make one point. If Radio Sawa were playing Chopin, Plato says music is the education of the soul, and there's a lot to be said for that. So if there had been like a WQXR programming, they could beam in 105.9 from that would actually be something I could get behind.
Actually, at the same time they instituted Sawa, they removed classical music from Voice of America program.
I'm going to throw on the table, not to answer now, but you may want to come back to the concept of American exceptionalism, because anytime I've written about that, I've gotten vehement emails from people angry about the concept of American exceptionalism and the question of whether that would be part of what you want to project to the world. You also reminded me, I just got to say, I was in Pakistan a few years ago for the State Department, about to give a lecture at a university. The professor in charge, eager to show me he was not an Islamist, and escorts me into the Noam Chomsky auditorium to give my remarks. So I want to go to historian Jeffrey Herf, who, by the way, has a great deal of knowledge about the uses of propaganda in the broadcast media and has done some great books on this.
Yeah, I was told I should identify myself
Yeah,
yet
you should.
again.
Who are you?
So I am Jeffrey Herf, and I teach in the history department at the University of Maryland. And I wanted to address this question of the theological safe haven. I'm a historian of modern Germany and of the Nazi era, and the work that I've done, and even more the work of many of my colleagues in Europe and in this country, has contributed to a deep understanding of the relationship between Christianity and National Socialism. There is no serious historian of the Holocaust or of Nazi Germany who would not discuss the contribution that Christianity, as it was interpreted by the Nazis, made to those events. Just as there are no historians of the Second World War who would not discuss the role, the meaning and importance of Christianity for Churchill and Roosevelt as they mobilized the Allies against Nazi Germany. So for historians, notions of selective tradition and the way that these huge traditions are interpreted by political actors is a commonplace. We do it all the time. Mr. Reilly made a very good point about condescension. I would think that there are millions of Muslims who think the United States has been lying to them by saying that Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. They know that's not true. Or rather, that the interpretation of Islam that's made in recent years by certain political actors is a causal factor. So my point is that the same standard that we use to interpret the role of religion in totalitarianism in modern European history should be applied to the way that political actors have interpreted religion in the Middle East and elsewhere in Muslim societies. That is, of course, the Quran did not lead to 9/11, but the interpretation of the Quran by certain particular individuals had a lot to do with it. And we lose our self-respect, and we lose the respect that other people have of us if we don't say these things that are so obviously true. They see through them. And then another point about Chopin and Leo Strauss. We in the universities need all the support that we can get for support for the humanities. And there are now several generations of students in American universities who have not received a proper education in the Western tradition with all of its positive and negative aspects. And there's a lot of talk about STEM and science and mathematics and how we need to support that, but we aren't going to win a war of ideas if one generation after another doesn't have the foggiest notion what liberalism is about. So that's more of a comment than a question, but perhaps it provokes the panel.
Sure, go ahead, Rob.
Yes, thank you for that comment. I've worked with Muslims for quite a few years, concentrating on Muslim intellectual reformers most especially. But I could say in general, Muslims couldn't care less what we think Islam is. And the only people we're confusing by the remarks made about Islam so often by our political and sometimes religious leaders, it just confuses us, which is unfortunate because then we can't fight our side of that war of ideas in terms of undermining the legitimacy of our opponents in the Muslim world. And so I'm so happy you picked up on the theological safe haven remark.
Yeah, I agree with what Robert just said, and I would also say that certainly I said many times, almost in exactly the same words that you used, that terrorists, that al-Qaeda is using a distorted interpretation of Islam. But I'll tell you, to get deep into the weeds on that one, if your audience is, terrorists or potential terrorists or supporters of terrorists, you or I, as an American, especially as an American Jew, have zero credibility, and so it doesn't work very well. But it's okay to say. I have no problem with saying it and being firm about it.
The point is not what President Bush or President Obama say to people in Egypt or in Pakistan, it's what they say to the American people. That's the point.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I think that's fine. And I think President Bush said that over and over again and made that clear when he went to the mosque a few days after 9/11.
We're going to go to David Ensor, a distinguished journalist. Make sure you identify yourself.
Thank you very much. David Ensor, a journalist. I'm the current director of the Voice of America, and it's nice to see a former director on the stage and another distinguished former person in the hallways where I work today, Jim Glassman. And thanks to the Foundation for holding this very thought-provoking discussion, I couldn't stay away from a panel on Is the West Losing the War of Ideas, clearly, given what my day job is now. Just a couple of quick things, and it's more of a statement than a question, but perhaps it'll provoke people. I definitely think that that in an uncertain world where the kinds of money that is now being spent on CCTV, on RT, and on well, let's just leave it at that. CCTV, Press TV, and RT. The billions that are being spent on spin and propaganda on those organizations, we do have a battle going on over ideas, and we are not adequately responding to those efforts. But I would just say that about Voice of America for 1 second. I mean, you're talking about a larger question, but within that question, there is the institutions we have. Voice of America reaches 164 million people a week. It reaches 1 in 5 Iranian adults watches our television every week. We have incredible reach into Iran, bigger than any other American institution of any kind in terms of talking to the Iranian people. So it's not nothing. Now, whether the right kinds of people and the right kinds of ideas are on there is a very good question, and one that I ask myself every day and work on. But we're not without tools, resources, in terms of talking to other societies. The growth of our audience in Africa right now is, it's hard to keep pace with it. It's very, very rapid. The human communications revolution that's underway right now as we reach to tablets and mobile phones that you can watch video on, extraordinary what VOA is able to do in terms of reach in northern Nigeria, in areas where Boko Haram is blowing things up. We're talking to those people. We have big, big audiences. So we, the United States, are not without resources. The most powerful thing that VOA does is it exports the First Amendment of the Constitution. It exports freedom of speech into places where it doesn't otherwise exist. It's not a negligible tool. It's not a negligible step we take. But the thing is, we only export the First Amendment. It's a journalistic organization. Some of our greatest strength comes when we cover an Abu Ghraib scandal, and we do so honestly, or when we report the NSA and Ed Snowden and all that stuff. Go ahead and tell that story, because that's the kind of country we are, and that's the kind of journalism that VOA does. That gives us credibility, that gives us audience, and that allows us to talk to societies, other societies, in a serious way about their problems and their challenges and these ideological and values questions. VOA is not values-free. It stands for freedom. And I think it's a powerful weapon. So it's come up a few times in the panel. I just wanted to sort of speak up for it and for the value of what it does. Thanks.
And as you answer that question, I urge you to, maybe a little bit provocative, there have been some serious criticisms made that I've heard of Voice of America, not least its Persian service. And if you know about that and have thoughts about that, this is a good forum in which to air those. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I should simply like to point out that the Voice of America is a tremendous asset for this country. It's been squandered over the past 10, 15 years. It's been degraded. Many of its key language services removed. If you looked at it strategically, you'd be stunned that we don't broadcast in Portuguese to Brazil. We don't broadcast in Hindi to India. We're only.
Why should we broadcast to Brazil? Don't they have a free press?
The largest. Well, because if we want the world to behave reasonably, we have to give it our reasons. We have to do that even to our friends. We're not just a institution of war.
But Robert, you know better than anybody that there are limited resources, and so if you have limited resources, it's probably better to broadcast into Iran or North Korea than into Brazil
you need to do,
or Greece.
Well, even with the limited resources, the week we shut down our Brazilian service, Jim, it was started to be carried in the internal radio network of the Brazilian Senate. And as soon as it was shut down, there was an outpouring from journalists in Brazil about it because they couldn't afford Washington bureaus. They wrote their news stories from VOA Brazilian. So we lost that whole secondary impact on
I'm not
that.
against broadcasting
Okay,
to
but
Brazil.
I-
I'm just saying
I don't
you're
like-
constantly confronted as a governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or just anybody in government with limited resources.
I
So you just
understand
have to
that.
make a decision.
We're not Qatar. I mean, it's not like we have all the resources we could possibly need to drive our message.
Here is the more serious criticism toward which I wanted to get. And that is that the leadership, and I'm not referring to the VOA director, but the leadership on the Broadcasting Board of Governors has not even seen the Voice of America as an instrument of U.S. public diplomacy, has publicly disavowed it as such an instrument, including a Republican chairman of the BBG who did that. And the current executive director of the BBG made a statement at National Defense University at a conference a year or two ago. Our mandate is not to influence.
Who was the Republican? You're talking about me?
No.
Okay,
So
good.
our mandate is not to influence.
Okay,
Well, then what the hell are you doing?
so
But here's I
So
think,
can I just say something really quick? I'm sorry, Brett. But okay, so this is actually the problem, and I think David, in his eloquent way, has raised it. The Broadcasting Board of Governors, if you read the legislation, has two, and in my view, conflicting missions. One is to do what David said, to advance the First Amendment, to be a real, live, journalistic organization with the values of a journalistic organization, to which I subscribe as somebody who's been a journalist since he was 12. And second, to be a tool of American foreign policy. Now that's kind of hard to do, frequently hard to do at the same time. One way to square that circle is to talk about what David did. Well, we export the First Amendment, but a lot of people, including me, believe that we should use our broadcasting asset to actually try to achieve specific goals of American foreign policy. But that's a difficult problem. That's not some kind of simple thing that we can resolve, because in fact it would degrade, I think, you can argue, the reputation of the institution if you did that. So I'm sorry, Brett.
well, no, I mean, I think I was going to make a similar point. Look, RT is effective because it's a propaganda organization, right? Propaganda is a legitimate and effective tool of government, okay? I don't like Russian propaganda, but I wouldn't mind American
Not sure
propaganda.
how effective it is.
I wouldn't mind American propaganda.
people are
I think
smart
the
and
concept
they
of,
smell it.
quote, exporting the First Amendment is not a proper concept for a taxpayer-funded arm of American foreign policy. If that's the case, then we should say Edward Snowden, and give equal space to someone who's going to say Edward Snowden is an American hero because, and therefore hopefully implicitly demonstrate just how wonderfully open-minded we are, that the concept of treason in this society really is a kind of a relative concept, and so and aren't we terrific? No, I mean, either you're going to have a propaganda arm, which ultimately we probably, maybe we want, maybe we don't. That's one question, but we can't have this kind of hybrid thing that's supposed to be a propaganda arm that showcases or demonstrates American virtues by not being propagandistic. And it's one or either we're going to have an RT model, or we're probably going to want to have none at all.
How about an Al-Jazeera America model, which I would say has an agenda,
Yeah.
but is way more subtle than RT in English.
Right. Look, the most important thing is, we're trying. Let's get back to the issue of this panel. We're trying to wage a war of ideas while having a very vague concept of what our ideas are or ought to be. And so until we get that concept, only when we understand what those ideas are can we then hone a communications and public relations strategy around them. And that's the core thing that's missing.
That's pretty tough, because if our enemies have a clear idea of what their ideas are, and we're muddy about what our ideas are, we're at a significant disadvantage in this ideological combat.
Well, it's, if you're in a war of ideas, you need an idea. And if you don't have one, your holster is empty.
Let's take some question back there, and then the lady in the red scarf, not the burgundy scarf, the red scarf.
Thank you.
Crimson.
Thank you, Cliff, and congratulations again on what you're doing here today. It's it's doing something quite amazing. It's provoking us all to think and to feel
that's
and
the
believe.
purpose.
And
And do identify yourself with the audience.
yes, I'm Richard Hellman of the Middle East Research Center Limited and CPAC, a Christian lobby for Israel. I confess that although I delivered papers at an early age and have a press pass, I am not a journalist, and I'm a recovering attorney and a professing, believing Christian. With that background and pretty full confession, I think you were hinting toward we need an idea, and I think if we keep it simple, it's not sectarian religion, and we're not going to defend Islam or any other religion effectively, certainly not, with all respect, a bunch of bureaucrats or public officials or journalists. It's not going to be acceptable. But I think there is an underlying principle in America. If we go back and you said, someone said FDR and Churchill could pray and be in a church service together on a battleship and pray for victory. And Reagan said there was an evil empire. Well, he was sure what was evil and what was good, and even if he was sometimes wrong, he was never in doubt about that.
I'm going to ask you just to get to the question, because I promised.
I think we have an underlying ethos, and as trite as it seems, because corporations have picked it up as their founding principle, it's what things soever you would that others do unto you, do you also unto them. For the Lord said that's the law and the prophets, and it comes out of Judaism, and I'm sure it's replicated in parts of Islam and other religions. If we had this kind of a faith that was taken abroad, and if we would defend those who take it abroad, including Christian ministers and Jewish journalists and others who run afoul of Muslims, I think we'd be far better off. If we stood for something, our people wouldn't fall for everything.
I'm going to go to the next question, and then you can comment on both together, because we're going to go short on time.
Good afternoon. My name is Shirin Nariman, and I'm with HRDIP, a human rights organization. And I want to ask the panelists about Voice of America and BBG, because I'm hearing a lot of concerns coming from Iran that, being Iranian, that Voice of America right now is the voice of more pro-regime people and not people that want the regime change in Iran. You don't hear their voice. So what is the role of Voice of America? From what analysis that I did and reading the BBG and everything, to me, it should be a media outlet to use the First Amendment, but also teaching people in Iran that you can have different ideas and views, and you can discuss and you can talk about it in a democratic situation. But particularly since 2009, things has gone down the road from Voice of America, the Persian part, because more and more we see that people that are against the regime are being taken out of the media from the Voice of America, and the programs are more toward more is concerned with Iranian regime rather than being a place for different people from different groups to come in and talk about and discuss the issues.
Let me get answers to that, and this will also be the last question. But David, if you need to address that, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do so. Bring a mic for David, because the frustration will be too much if you. I don't play. No. Seriously, I want you to talk about it for a moment first, and then we'll talk about it here and sum up, if I may ask you to do.
Oh, thank you. With all due respect, VOA Persian is a news organization doing 6 hours a day of live television in Farsi, covering the news. We also do satire. We make fun of the Ayatollah in our satirical program out of New York. We do all kinds of things. We have every kind of voice that I know of that you can find anywhere in America and get into a studio or on the telephone out of Iran on our air. You may not be satisfied with the mix right now. You might have preferred it in 2009. I don't know. But I do not speak Farsi and can't follow every single sentence of what's broadcast, but we keep a pretty close eye on things. And as I said, we stand for freedom. We broadcast comprehensive news. People in Iran don't get it unless they either listen to us or the BBC. There is no other way.
May I ask for final comments? We'll start with you, Jim.
Oh, well, I just want to comment quickly on Persian News Network. And I certainly can't judge anything that's happened in the last few years. I can tell you that I was on there twice on their daily call-in show. I think you still have that daily call-in show, right, David? And this is one of the most amazing things about this institution, about the BBG, that people are calling in to a studio in Washington and hearing from people like me and people in government, people in academia, and talking directly, answering questions. It's pretty amazing. It's quite an important asset. I don't think we should get fixated whenever these discussions come up about war of ideas. Everybody ends up talking about the BBG, which I guess in some ways is good if you've been chairman of the BBG.
Broadcasting Board of Governors.
Broadcasting Board of Governors. Okay, Voice of America and all that. But that's not all. And the BBG does have that problem that I tried to describe earlier. There's a lot more that can be done in the war of ideas than in broadcasting. And this issue of we or who's important in driving the ship, I don't think there's any doubt of what the answer is, and it is the President of the United States. So, Robert has said nice things about me during my short tenure, and so I'm happy when I get that kind of praise. But the fact is that I never could have done anything, the few things that I did do, if it hadn't been for the fact that the President of the United States, at that moment in history, understood the importance of soft power and gave his secretary and his undersecretary full support in doing the kinds of things that we did. Amazingly enough, I don't think we're getting that right now. And I think if you want to talk about what the big problem is now, for some reason, this White House does not understand the importance of soft power. It's either drones or it's some kind of very, very weak, leading from behind diplomacy. It's not the stuff that's in the middle. And I think that's the big deficiency right now. It's not institutional. It doesn't have that much to do with BBG. It really starts at the top. And we're never going to get the changes that everybody in this room wants unless we have a President of the United States supported by people like Ed Royce in Congress who say, hey, this is really important, and we're going to get behind it.
Robert.
Well, I think as under this administration we continue to withdraw from some strategic places in the world, our supercilious public diplomacy is almost in tandem with that move. I want to say when I was Voice of America director, our Persian service was one of the finest, led by Ali Jalali. But I was approached by the Minister of Information in Afghanistan, the first post-Taliban Minister of Information, met with me privately and said, your Afghan services, Pashto Dari, are known in my country as Radio Taliban. You have a problem. And indeed we did. And I changed the leadership in those services. In fact, Ali Jalali went over there, cleaned them up, after which there was never another complaint. These problems can often arise because obviously the Voice of America uses people from the countries to which we're broadcasting. They come with grudges, they come with their own political agendas, but with the proper leadership, and with the proper ideas, Jim, that kind of thing can be addressed. Since this is the last thing I get to say, I have to disagree with Bret Stephens about something, and it's about establishing a new USIA. If it's worth doing badly. And let me tell you, it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. And the BBG has to be abolished. Sorry, Jim. And the Voice of America brought back in the chain of command of the executive branch of the government, so once again, it can be the great national security asset it has been before.
Reg, you get the final word.
I guess the final thing I want to say is that the essence of the American or the Western political tradition comes in the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life and liberty as the great Judeo-Christian ideas, pursuit as in the great capitalist idea, and happiness as in the core of Aristotelian political philosophy. And if you can just get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into everything you say and do in your programming, then I would support any kind of government agency under any sort of arrangement that would promote that. But I don't think Americans spend quite enough time thinking about the meaning of that particular creed, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've voided the ideas of freedom. They are contentless ideas. Britney Spears is not really life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or at least she's a very minor branch of it. But how do you create an education and great ideas, and how do you share that around the world? I think that's a really profound question. And I'd love to see, someone like Jeff Herf right there, who I have the pleasure of actually seeing for the first time, although we've communicated, many times, or Claudia Rosette, a few rows behind Jeff, doing something like that. That's a serious thing, and it can be, I guess I'd make one final point. I grew up in Mexico City, and Mexico, when I was growing up, was under the PRI, and it was under a bunch of dinosaurs. And all of a sudden, very quickly, Mexico liberalized and became a functioning and actually rather successful democracy. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because a handful of individuals who had been educated mainly at the University of Chicago in free market economics understood what was ailing the socialist economy of Mexico at a given moment of crisis in the country. If we can find some way to start educating a handful of individuals in the concepts of liberty and the great Western political tradition, which in its own way is a universal political tradition, we can start doing it even in a small way and seeding them into positions of authority in an Egypt, a Tunisia, a Yemen, or Saudi Arabia, and so on, then we can do a great deal of good. And I would rather have those concentrated efforts in getting first-class individuals into positions of influence around the world than 23 hours a day of Britney and J-Lo.